This is Johnny Kunkel, and in this video we're going to take a look at the rollup, the cube, and then look at grouping sets as well. In the rollup, if we look at the slide here, notice that we are using a group by rollup, and then we're indicating that we're doing this by vendor ID. If we look at the results here, we have our vendor ID, our invoice count, and invoice totals. This is essentially the same information that you would see if you were doing a group by, but the rollup is also going to give us a final total of everything that is by vendor ID. And we can see that here that we have a total of 114 for our invoice count for all of the vendors, as well as the invoice total for all of the vendors. So it gives us an extra dimension. Think of this as if we were doing some type of a report, typically you're going to have the detail lines and then you're going to have some type of final total. This is kind of what this is providing to us. Let's go ahead and go to SQL Server Management Studio. We have our query here. Let's go ahead and simplify this query. Let's start with just department ID. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit. We're going to get rid of our shift at this point. We want to start with just having our department, and we're going to do the count for our employee count. Let's call this imp count. And we will also be trying to only select those where our end date is null. And we want to go ahead and do a group by. And this time we are going to roll up, and within parentheses we're going to specify the field or fields that we want to roll up. And in the first case we're just going to do department, and look at this. If we execute this, we have all of our departments with their totals, and then of course we have our department that has its total. Now if we introduce the shift, and then put in our shift here and execute this query. So what we see here is we have our shift count. That's going to give us the summary. Then this is the department count individually. So we're getting that extra total for when we have different departments. And then we get our final total down below. So it's going to give us more of, if we're doing more of a control break. So when we are getting our employees, that's our details. When we change our department, then we're going to print out a total. So every time that we print out our department, change our department, it's going to print out the total. Here we have multiple records for the same department, and then it's going to print out the total of all those. And then when we get down at the bottom, it's going to print out everything. So that's kind of what the group by rollup is going to do. And before we change over, let's change this to a cube. And if I go ahead and do a cube, this is going to essentially give us every dimension as far as the results. Let's change this just to look at it from the department ID first. We can add the shift in later. If we execute this, right now we see that it's just giving us the null for that. If we add in our shift, and then execute this, we can see that we have our department. We have a null here for our departments, and then we have more, so it's giving it based off of the shift. So this is the shift, where I have all these people that are working on the first shift, followed by second shift and then third shift. And then after I do that, then it's going to give me the department totals, and I can see those there. And then I can see that I have my null is going to give me all of my employees for every department and shift overall. So it's giving me everything there, and it's just breaking it up, and I have 3 different dimensions of results that it's actually printing out for me. The next thing that we want to take a look at is grouping sets. I'm going to switch back over to the PowerPoint, And this is going to be where we can group by a grouping set, and we can specify one or more fields to be in a grouping set, or we can have combination of fields that we can place in the grouping set. In this case, we're doing it by vendor state and vendor city, and we can see that we're getting results back in vendor state that doesn't have a vendor city, so it's grouping and counting there. And then when we do it off of our vendor city, that's where we're not going to get counts here, but we're going to get counts here of every vendor city in Washington, regardless of the state, and it's going to give us the counts back. If we look at the next slide, this is going to be a little bit more involved. We have a grouping set that's going to be the vendor and state, vendor city combination, and then we have vendor zip code, and then we have like a summary. So we can see all kinds of different combinations here that we're getting out. We can have our vendor state, vendor city with a null zip code. Then we have our vendor state, vendor city combination with our zip codes, and then we have our summary. So we can do multiple fields together as well as one of our grouping sets. And if we go back to our SQL Server Management Studio, let's take a look at how this might look, and then let's run through just a simple scenario that kind of illustrates what we're trying to get back. Okay, so if I go ahead and I decide that I want to do a grouping set, I can go ahead and select my department and shift and employee count. So let's grab that. This is going to be from our human resource. We still want to do where our date and date is null, so I'm going to add those as well. But this is where we are going to group by a grouping set. And in this case, maybe we want to start out with doing it where we want to get the totals for the departments, we want to get the totals for the shifts, and then we want to get an all-inclusive total. And I can just say department ID, the shift ID, and when I want just the summary, I just put empty parentheses, and I can go ahead and run this query. If I run this, you can see that I have my shift totals, I have my department totals, and if I scroll down at some point, I have my department ID and my shift ID. Those are both null, and that's returning 290. So that's going to be the all-inclusive total. Now that's really good, but what is this really doing for us? If we look at a query, and I'm just going to copy this in to save just a little bit of time, this is essentially going to be the same as if we execute this query. Essentially, where I want to do a select for my department, I'm just selecting the shift as null, getting the count for my departments, using my group by on my department ID, and then I'm doing a union, and then essentially selecting the shift and its count, and then the department ID is selected as null from the employee department history grouping by that shift ID. So I'm getting the department counts, I'm getting the shift counts, and then I want to go ahead and union that with just the count of all employees. And then when I put all those together based off those union statements, it's going to return to me essentially everything that I selected here. So that's kind of the whole concept of a grouping set. But again, it gets really confusing with our results here, what we really have. We have to look and kind of interpret all these nulls, and if we have a null, then we know that we have kind of a grand total, and if we have just a null in the department ID, it's going to be the shift total, and then if we have a null over in the shift ID, then that's going to be a department total. But it would really be nice if we could actually print out a column that says what it is. And this also applies for if we're doing a cube or anything where we're doing a rollup, we can use a grouping ID to determine what we have. So let's go ahead and add a new column, and this is going to be grouping ID, and we just basically give it our department ID and our shift ID. And when we do that, it's going to give us some type of calculated number. When we have the shift ID, it's going to be 2. When we have the totals for everything, it's going to be 3. And when we have the department, it's going to be 1. And of course, that's going to correspond to our departments is 1, our shift ID is 2, and then our totals is 3. So it's going to give us that level, which gives us a little bit more information, but still it would be nice if we could print out something that based off of that grouping ID is going to tell us whether it's all departments or department total or shift total or grand total or something to that effect. And we can use essentially a case statement to do that. So if I go ahead and add case before my grouping ID, I can then give it when conditions of when I have a value of 1, then what am I going to do? And in this case, we would just say that when we have 1, it's going to equate to a department total. When we have 2, then it's going to be a shift total. And when we have 3, then it's going to be a grand total. Then we go ahead and close our case statement with an end. And at this point, then if we run this query, it's going to give us back a little bit more information. And we could essentially say that this is going to be as total type or something. And at least we have a column name coming back. And it's essentially going to give us more information. We can more easily sift out what type of total without trying to infer based off of those null values. And especially when we're doing our cube, that comes into play too. I have my cube up here, and if I go through and put in my grouping ID, we can see what values we get out of from that cube. And if I look at it, I'm getting 0, I have 2, I have 1s, I have 3s, so I'm getting the same thing out. I can just as easily output when I have a detail record. That's going to be the first dimension, so it's essentially going to be the combination of the department and shift. It's going to be 6. Then I have, for my department IDs, that's going to be the shift ID, so I can go through and just essentially print out the grouping ID, use that same type of case to print out better titles for those rollups so that it seems like they make a little bit more sense than just seeing that null value there in that column. So hopefully that makes sense. Now switching to Oracle, we have our last query that I'm going to copy and use as a basis for our rollup, our cube, and grouping sets. We don't necessarily have a combination of fields that we can roll up or group. So this is going to be pretty flat, but we just want to illustrate that we can do the same types of SQL statements in Oracle that we have done in SQL Server. And I can start by doing the rollup. And I'm going to be using my product ID to roll up. And when I execute this, it's essentially going to give me that total down there. If I change this to a cube, now cubes gives us all dimensions, but I really just have my product ID and I have my grand total. I don't have any additional fields, so I can only roll it up. And it's going to look more like my rollup than really a cube, because the cube is intended to be more dimensions. And if I run this, then essentially I have my grand total at the top, and then I have my product totals. Then if I decide that I want to maybe output my grouping ID to see if I can do that as well. So if I type in grouping ID and then put in my product ID, we can get that value out that we could then use a case statement to output something more meaningful, just like we did in SQL Server. If we want to try to group by a grouping set, in this case, we want to do our grouping set on our product ID, and then we also want to put in our total, grand total, and then that's just going to be our parentheses. And if I run that, it's essentially going to function the exact same way. And I can see down below, I have my grand overall total for all products, same as what I had, and it's using that grouping ID of 1. So this essentially works the same way between SQL Server and in Oracle.